Babies learn language much more efficiently when they see a human face talking to them. They lock into that, and it almost like turns on the switch in their brain that says, I need to pay attention now because this loving grown-up that I know loves me is talking to me.
Welcome to the Healthy Screen Habits Podcast. I'm Hillary Wilkinson. Whether you're starting your parenting journey with a newborn or looking to connect with your teen on technology, let's learn some new healthy screen habits together. I've been following the work of my guest today for years. He is an absolute pioneer in the realm of brain development. If you've heard about any of the studies that discuss disorganized white matter in the brains of children who used more than the American Academy of Pediatrics recommendation of screen time, you will have heard about him. He's the guy who brought all of this to light. And today we are going to discuss brain science, toddlers, and screens, plus what you can be doing to enrich your child's brain development. I am truly honored to welcome today Dr. John Hutton.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here, Hillary.
Thank you. So, Dr. Hutton, brain science is a really big topic. And I think when we start with really big topics, it's best to start, kind of to quote Sound of Music, start at the very beginning. So if we can have kind of a primer on the most basic parts of brain anatomy, the area that you discuss in your JAMA Pediatrics publication titled Associations Between Screen-Based Media Use and Brain White Matter Integrity in Preschool Age Children. Can you define for us what is brain white matter versus gray matter?
It's a great question. I think very often, scientists and others take for granted that these terms and this jargon is sort of generally understood by the public, but it is a little vague. Why is it called matter? We don't really, what's the matter? We don't, it's a kind of a funny term, but essentially, gray matter and white matter. The term started by what they look like on brain imaging scans, like on an MRI or on a CAT scan, and the gray matter is basically the surface of the brain. It's where the cells are, what are called neurons. And those are the ones that, have all the genes in them and all the the parts of the machine essentially that talk to each other. It's also called the cortex, which is the surface of the brain. And it's very thin. It's only a few millimeters thick all at the surface. The white matter, by contrast, takes up most of the space in the brain, and it's basically the wires that connect these cells together. And it's white because it has a fatty coating on it called myelin, which is essentially it's a fatty acid that is like the rubber on an electric wire in your house. It makes these wires communicate more rapidly, essentially. So gray matter cells, white matter wires connecting the cells to each other.
Okay. It's kind of indicative in the title of the study, but can you tell us what that study talked about with the overuse of screens and white matter?
Yeah, and so what we did is, I mean, there in MRI, there's a bunch of different types of scans you can do. There are scans that involve some kind of task, which is called fMRI or functional MRI, where the child or whoever it is does something when they're in the scanner, and you're looking more at activity in the brain. And then there's structural scans, which are looking basically what it sounds like what it is. It's looking at the structure of the brain, whether it's how thick the cortex or gray matter is, or what the white matter looks like, how well developed it is, for example. So the study we published in the journal JAMA Pediatrics, which was in 2019, was really the first of its kind to look at the question of what is the relationship between screen use in young children. And all my work involves preschool age kids, age 3 to 5, which is about as young as you can get to get kids to voluntarily cooperate in the scanner, without having a tantrum or having to be asleep. But in any case, so we were looking at the relationship between digital media use or screen time and the structure of the white matter in the brain at this sort of critical age.
And what is it? So we're talking, like you said, preschool age. And what makes this age group so kind of critical to study, do you think, in regards to screen use particularly?
Yeah, that's a great question too. So the brain is developing most rapidly in that 0 to 5 age range. Babies are born with the most brain cells they'll ever have, like 100 billion brain cells. And they have the connections between them are really dense. They're not very well organized yet. So that's why babies are not able to walk yet. Their language hasn't developed yet. Their emotional regulation is still immature. It's because the brain cells that they have are talking to each other, but the connections between them haven't been refined yet. And the period of early childhood in 0 to 5 is basically when a lot of that architecture in the brain is shaped, when a lot of the connections, sort of the white matter between different areas of the brain is refined so that these skills start to ripen. So that's when, for example, vision and hearing, mature pretty early. Language starts to develop very rapidly, starting around age 2 when vocabulary takes off and kids are learning 3 to 5 words a day. Social skills start to develop. It's just really the most dynamic period of early brain development in that 0 to 5 space. Then there's a little bit of a steady state where certainly the brain's developing rapidly. Kids from 5 to 10 are growing and learning, but the next really big takeoff is in adolescence when the brain really starts to change again pretty rapidly in response to puberty. But yeah, but 0 to 5 is sort of where it's at in terms of those real foundational fundamental skills.
When you're looking at young children who have exceeded the screen time recommendations, what sort of, I feel like I'm asking the same question again, but I just feel like it's really important data and I really want people to hear it.
Yeah.
What type of structural changes have you seen?
Yeah, and one thing that's important about that study, going back to the 2019, and is we used a measure in that study called the screen Q, which isn't just one question. It's a lot of the brain research, or not even brain research, but a lot of the research around screen time or media use involves a single question. How many hours per day does your child watch TV or use a screen? The screen Q, by contrast, is 15 items that really summarize the American Academy of Pediatrics guidelines. There's four main contexts of screen use in those. There's access to screens, such as does a child have a screen in their bedroom? Do they have a portable device they carry with them? Are they able to use screens at meals or in the car? Frequency of use, how many minutes per day, days per week? Content, is it fast moving content? Is it violent content? Really, essentially, what is the child using? And then co-viewing is the parent using the media with the child? Are they asking questions about what the child's watching, for example? So all these questions came together to give a score, the Screen Q total score that really reflected a higher score was greater non-adherence, so greater like not following the American Academy of Pediatrics guidelines. So in our study, what we did is we took a bunch of kids. We had about 60 kids that were preschool age, and we administered the screen cue to their parent to get a sense of what's their media landscape like at home. We brought them in, did MRI scanning, did a bunch of different kinds of scans, but the one we looked at in that study was looking at white matter. It's a type of scan called diffusion tensor imaging, or DTI, which is a fancy term for what do the white matter connections look like. And we found that kids with higher scores on the screen cue or less adherence to American Academy of Pediatrics guidelines had less well-developed white matter really all over their brain, but especially in areas that are involved with language and literacy, which was really the core question in the study. It was a part of a bigger study that also looked at reading and the amount of reading in the home and how that affects the brain. And then we also administered some behavioral tests. And that's the thing about MRI is a lot of times you'll get a picture, but you're not, excuse me, but you're not quite sure what it means. So you want to connect it with something not related to the scan, like what sort of behavioral correlate or how does this scan connect with like the score on a language measure or some sort of validated test. So we administered four different sort of measures of early language and literacy, and kids with higher screen time also had lower scores on all of those measures, significantly so. So we had less well-developed white matter and lower scores on cognitive tests for kids with more exposure to digital media in all these different contexts.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. I don't know if you're at liberty to make predictive analysis, but so as we age, what I've learned is that our white matter tends to thin. Am I correct in understanding that?
It can. So
Okay.
the general rule with white matter is there's an adage in brain science, neurons that fire together wire together.
Mhm.
So really it's a use it or lose it situation. Like the more, and I think in general, as we age, the level of myelin and the white matter probably does go down, but there's also a lot of evidence that the more we use our brains, whether it's reading or interacting with other people or meditation or whatever it is, we can help preserve that white matter and even build it up just by using those circuits that the white matter is involved with. So so for kids, I mean, kids are still building that white matter up. So kids, when they're little, their brains are a little more on the gray side because, or when they're babies, because the white matter hasn't really started to develop fully yet. And then as they get older, you'll see the scans, the difference between the gray matter and white matter on the scan starts to really sharpen because those brain connections are being what's called myelinated. The coating around those wires and that white matter is starting to get thicker and denser, and that makes those connections communication faster and more efficient. And so, in young kids who are developing these early skills, the more they practice something, the thicker this white matter gets, the more well developed these circuits get. And that's what we found on our scan was just that the kids that had more screen exposure had just less evidence of less of that myelination happening in these brain areas that connect important parts of the brain that support language and literacy and a lot of other skills, executive function.
So we have to take a break, but when we come back, I will be asking Dr. Hutton what we can be doing to strengthen brain growth and the difference between reading aloud or using a tablet. Did you know that Healthy Screen Habits does workshops? For 2 days, we can come and guide students through an exploration of their own tech use and facilitate a research based presentation bespoke to their own questions. 87.5% of the teens who participated in this workshop recorded a change in their tech use following participation. For more information, contact us at info@healthyscreenhabits.org. I'm speaking with Dr. John Hutton, who is an associate professor in the Division of General and Community Pediatrics at UT Southwestern Dallas Children's Hospital and an adjunct associate professor at Cincinnati Children's Hospital. So, in addition to over 50 scientific articles, he has also published over 40 children's books. And many of these books have health promoting themes for littles like safe sleep and interactive reading and limiting screen time. That's this whole series that's called Baby Unplugged, which you'll find linked in our show notes. Before we dive into your book stuff, I kind of have a question that I want to go back to the whole, I'm picturing littles in this MRI setting. I've only experienced MRI due to like injury or needing a scan of something, but it is a very tight space and you have to be very still. So, how do you collect imaging on what is arguably the squirmiest population set?
Yeah, that's a great question. That's one of the biggest questions that we get is sort of how do you do this? Because it's really that, and that's one of the reasons I think that the evidence is relatively scant at that age. Is just it's hard to do that kind of study, and there aren't a lot of places that can do it just based on the technicians involved. I mean, really one of the biggest challenges in brain imaging research at that age is just getting kids to cooperate. Um, all of our scanning paradigms are play based. We don't ever sedate the kids. That's unethical. So really the parents bring them in voluntarily. So first of all, you have to, do successful recruitment where the parents have to agree to bring the kids in. We try to do a time of day when they're not too tired. It's not nap time, it's not lunchtime. But they do usually come in, and we'll start slow. Do maybe read a book or play with some toys in the lobby, and then we start the process of just kind of getting them to buy into the idea that we're going into this room with this big machine in it, and what is that machine? Why is it making those noises? And we've got a couple of different games that we've played before with them. There's the rocket ship game, the spaceship game, where we're going on a trip to space, and you're an astronaut, and you've got to sit really still in this tube for about 20 to 30 minutes, and they'll kind of buy into that or they won't. The other was a statue game where they come in, they got to stay really, really still for a little while, and then after that's over, they're gonna get a toy to take home, and uh, and we've had pretty good success with that. We also have a practice scanner outside of the real scanner that's essentially a gurney with like a big kind of wooden thing around it, like a donut that looks like a scanner. So we want to get them comfortable in that tight space because a lot of kids will get a little claustrophobic, they'll get
Sure.
anxious. But yeah, they're all play based. Really the biggest job is just getting them to get in there. And then we have like a little like a strap basically that's not tight or painful or anything, but just kind of holds their head still. Then it's like a little helmet. And then for the structural scans, they can actually watch a video. The thing about screens is, kids that are watching their favorite show will sit pretty still. So they can do that during the structural scans just to sit still. Because if they move more than 5 millimeters, it sort of throws off the scan. I mean, it has to be really, really still. And then for the functional scans, we'll have a task that they'll do, whether it's hearing a story read aloud through headphones or asking questions. And those more interactive scans can be great if the child's involved, but sometimes the kids will get a little antsy. But long story short, it's just you've just got to get the kids to trust you. And the staff we have are great with that. If they get scared or anxious, we turn the scan off right away. They can get up and walk out. I mean, there's never any sort of sense of, you got to stay in there or you get in trouble. We find that girls have been a little better than boys in terms of sitting still in there, and I'm a boy, so I can say that, I guess. But it just depends. And overall, we've been very pleased. We've had about 80+% success rate, getting kids to come in and finish the scans. So
Wow.
anyway,
Yeah. Yeah. No, I I can understand how enacting all the different kinds of play leads to a lot of buy-in because I think as parents we all do that, right? We enact,
yeah,
to get out the door. You might race or you might have a treasure hunt or something like this. So, yeah,
yeah,
using play as a tool. Just like you're using tech as a tool. We are not anti-tech at Healthy Screen Habits. We're pro intentional use. So,
yeah,
if you're using it
yeah,
intentionally.
for sure. And the rooms is decked out, to look like, it's a child-friendly space. And that's one of the things about working at a children's hospital is just, it by design, there's sort of more, planets and dinosaurs and other things all over the place that help the child to feel comfortable.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, for sure. Let's go back to what you were talking about before the break of that phrase, neurons that fire together, wire together. And talking about would it be appropriate to say tracks within
Yeah,
the brain?
for
Okay,
sure.
so building tracks. I've also heard, because like I said, I've been following your work for years. You use this phrase biological embedding. And can you, just because for my own, I do this podcast because I have questions I want answered. And
Yeah.
that's a question I have. So I have kind of two questions. My understanding is that this biological embedding happens with that track formation. I'm wondering, A, if I have that right, and B, is there any other time in our lifespan when we have this sort of embedding that happens, or is it specific to early childhood?
It's a great question. So I think there's what I see as real critical periods for these sort of foundational experiences. It really biological embedding essentially is however an experience impacts your neurobiology. So whether it's a nurturing experience in the home where you form brain networks that are involved with just a greater feeling of safety and sort of less anxiety, for example, or early exposure to language. children that are talked to a lot and are encouraged to talk more often, that experience is embedded in their brain through more resilient, stronger language networks. And then these networks tend to persist through the lifespan. I mean, that early foundation sort of is your basic neural architecture you'll take with you through the rest of your life. And you can either continue to maintain that and build it up, or you can neglect it and it'll start to erode, to your question earlier about as we get older, does our myelination go away? Um, but early childhood is just when the real foundation happens, like the foundation of your house. And then I'd say the other period where there's a lot of that same type of embedding is in adolescence. When kids are going through puberty, when their brains dramatically change again in response to their hormones. And that's when a lot of the basic wiring that has to do with social cognition, understanding the feelings of others, empathy, where do I belong in the world? How do I fit in? And how do I connect with other people? And probably evolutionarily, that goes back to like a sense of, how do I know that I'm an acceptable mate for someone else, and to go out and
Mhm.
connect with someone else and then go on and have offspring. But for us, it's, in teenagers nowadays, it's just that sense of belonging in the world. And I think that's when a lot of the good things can happen that relate to digital media use if it's used properly, in a pro-social, appropriate way. But it can also when a lot of negatives can happen when it's abused and either overused or the wrong content or too isolating or whatever it is. Um, the other factor that comes into play is kids also are born with predispositions to different types of traits, whether they're predisposed to have really strong language skills or predisposed to anxiety or predisposed to addiction. That's also going to impact how they respond to these early experiences and how those are embedded in their brain. So it's a really a combination of sort of genetics, experiences, and neurobiology.
Okay. Yeah. So I'm worrying that as we're talking about all of this very early use, very early neural growth, that people are going to be listening to this and they're going to feel like, oh no, I've ruined my children. It's too late. Let them watch all the TV. None of it matters.
No, not at all.
That's yeah. So can you talk about, is there like a secret sauce that can get neurons fired, wired, connecting with all the good stuff?
For sure. And it's never too late. I mean, I hear that a lot from parents that there's a lot of parental guilt out in the world, and
Mhm.
it's a complicated landscape. I'm very, very glad that I was not a kid, that I'm not a kid in today's world, where there's so many products and things that are marketed as educational, things that are marketed that are just, I mean, there's just a waterfall of products out there that parents are supposed to navigate their children through or help them with. So, I think parents, guilt, take that off the table. It's just all about doing your best, meeting your kids where they are, and, in the context of your own family circumstances. But, if a child, let's say, watched a lot of TV when they were little, had a tablet in their bedroom, whatever, and that you start to see some negatives manifest when they get to school, you can always try to turn that around and really just change the types of exposures they're getting. We can get at this a little bit later, but taking screens out of the bedroom, for example, starting to encourage other types of behaviors that can reshape some of these connections in the brain. And it's never too late.
Mhm.
Certainly early childhood is very important because that's when the brain is most plastic, when it's responding really, really efficiently to experiences. And that's why 0 to 5 is so critical because you get really the most bang for your buck at that time. Early exposure to lots of storybooks, for example, reading to your kids a lot in their early childhood is really likely to pay a really strong dividends in terms of their language and relationship to books going forward, just because their brains is very receptive at that age. If you never read to your kids until they were teenagers and then you start then, it could be enjoyable and effective, but it's less likely they're going to have as much bang for their buck in terms of their language just because their brains are different. But it still works, but just early childhood is it's just where
Right.
the
Right.
secret
And
sauce. No, sorry.
I was going to say, why? Like, what is it about reading aloud that that works so well?
Reading aloud, the power of that is it's just such a powerful catalyst for bringing grown-ups and kids together. I mean, the secret sauce of early development in general is loving grown-ups and their kids spending time together. I mean, and that's, I think, just evolutionarily hardwired in our brains. I mean, the human brain essentially is an analog organ that evolved over millions of years to process five senses, sight, sound, touch, taste, and hearing, and then and also interactions with other people, social skills, like to sort of perceive the world, whether it's connection with other humans or danger. So that's just what it does really well. And the thing about digital media is it simulates the real world. So it simulates interactions with real people. It provides some senses, but not all of them, mostly audio visual. And so you get some of the things the brain's evolved to process, but not all of them. It's very entertaining. You can connect with other people through, like we're doing now, through FaceTime or Zoom or whatever. So there's a lot of amazing things technology does, but it just doesn't do everything.
Mhm.
And so the brain, I think, has evolved to really need certain things, especially in early childhood, particularly interactions with loving caregivers. And that's been shown in babies, where babies learn language much more efficiently when they see a human face talking to them. They lock into that, and it almost like turns on the switch in their brain that says, I need to pay attention now because this loving grown up that I know loves me is talking to me. Because otherwise, there's so many sounds they're exposed out to in the world, that they kind of tune out a lot of them. But when the loving caregiver comes into play, that's when the brain really starts to crackle in a good way.
Okay.
So,
And
yeah.
that kind of feeds right into my next question, which as far as read alouds go, there's all kinds of read alouds, quote unquote dictated story. Like they're being called read alouds, but it's more like a listening to a story on a tablet or a device. And do these have the same kind of beneficial effect as a parent or caregiver reading out loud?
It's I would say partially. The thing about the read alouds on devices, and when you can click the button and it says "read to me," is the other thing about story sharing or reading is it can be a one-way exercise when you're reading to your child and they're listening, but it's really optimal when it's a two-way exercise. When you're asking questions called dialogic reading, when you read a part of the book, point at the picture, the child says something, and when they're a baby they might just say, try to say the word. When they're older, they can say how they feel about what they're hearing. So the interactive reading, the back and forth, is really where not only is the child hearing language, but they're also practicing speaking. So you
Mm,
get the expressive language benefit and the receptive language benefit, as well as the social benefit, where they can bring in how do they feel about the story. I'm scared of bears, mom, or whatever, and then they can talk about bears. Or I'm scared of the dark. I mean, you can just bring a whole nother layer to the story beyond the words on the page and the pictures. And it's a catalyst for just a human interaction. The devices, by comparison, are very entertaining. I mean, you click the button, the child's locked in, they're going to really watch it. But most of what they're going to get is going to be listening and watching. They rarely will be talking to their device. And if they talk to it, although that's changing with a lot of the Siri and Alexa, which kind of creeps me out a little bit, but I know that it's coming, is the device doesn't really talk back to them and doesn't really talk about how they're feeling. And it's an open question. Let's say a device is reading to a child and they say, I love dogs, and then the device says, tell me about how you love dogs. Will that have the same benefits that if their mom was asking them the same questions? I don't think it will,
mhm.
but that's going to be coming, I think. But in any case, it's just the limitations of the device are just that they tend to be a lot more isolating, and a lot more of a one-way experience. We published a couple studies looking at differences in audiobooks, illustrated picture books, and animated stories, and we found that in the brain, what's going on is that in the audiobooks, kids, there's some evidence in preschool age kids that they're struggling a little bit to understand what's going on in the story. It's entertaining, but sometimes they'll hear words they don't understand, and there's evidence their brain's straining a little bit to sort of make sense of the story, just because they maybe haven't seen a lot of the things that they're hearing. In an animated book, there's a real focus on the visual processing. There's sort of hyper engagement of the visual networks, where essentially the most of the brain activity is involved with tracking what's going on in the story. and there's less of a engagement of language networks and other imagination related networks. But in picture books, there's just enough of a visual cue where the visual networks are involved, but also there's this really balanced connection of the language network talking to the visual networks and then bringing in the imagination part of the brain to come together with the whole story in the picture. And that's probably why kids at that age like picture books, is it's just enough visual but not too much, and it
Mhm.
allows their imaginations to do some work.
Well, we have to take a short break, but when we come back, I'm going to ask Dr. Hutton for his healthy screen habit.
At what age should I give my child a smartphone? How much screen time should I allow each day? What are the best filters to use on my family's devices? Sound familiar? These questions and more are answered at the Healthy Screen Habits website. We've curated the best articles, books, videos, and many other resources to help you figure out how you want to use technology in your life. Click on the awareness section to learn about the issues and dangers surrounding screen use. Then click on the Tools page to download printables you can use with your family today, including the Healthy Screen Habits Family Technology Plan. Visit our website at www.healthyscreenhabits.org for the resources and tools you need to get started.
I'm speaking with Dr. John Hutton, the spokes doctor for the Read Aloud 15 Minutes national campaign and co-author of forthcoming American Academy of Pediatrics Literacy Promotion Guidelines. He also works closely with the Children and Screens Institute, which is where we had the pleasure of connecting. So on every episode on the Healthy Screen Habits podcast, I ask each guest for a healthy screen habit. And this is going to be a tip or takeaway that our listeners can put into practice in their own home. Do you have one?
I do. I mean, I think my main tip that I give as a pediatrician is really, as much as possible, beginning as early as possible, to keep screens out of the bedroom, and really to focus on the context of screen use. Where is the child allowed to use it? And we just know that use in the bedroom tends to lead to the most negative impacts, whether it's too much screen use, impacting sleep, not being able to police the content very well, isolated viewing. So as much as you can keep screens out of the bedroom, that's a huge win. And then the other is more broad, is sort of, there's a tagline for Baby Unplugged called Screen Free Until 3. For those parents out there who are either expecting or have really little kids, the longer you can keep kids off of screens when they don't know what they're missing is easier, and it's going to have a really potentially big impact on not only the child, but on the parent too, spending quality time together.
As always, you can find a complete transcript of this show and a link to any of the resources discussed by visiting the show notes for this episode. Do this by going to healthyscreenhabits.org, click the podcast button, and find this episode. Dr. Hutton, thank you for being here today. It's been very interesting to learn about brain growth and to see what we can all do to foster the healthiest start for kids and screen habits.
It's been a pleasure, Hillary. Thank you so much.
For more information, you can find us on Instagram and Facebook at Healthy Screen Habits. Make sure to visit our website, healthyscreenhabits.org, where you can subscribe to the show on Apple Podcasts or via RSS, so you'll never miss an episode. It's free, it's fun, and you get a healthy new screen habit each week. While you're at it, if you found value in this show, we'd appreciate you giving us a quick rating. It really does help other people find us and spread the word of healthy screen habits. Or if you'd simply like to tell a friend, we'd love that too. I so appreciate you spending your time with me this week, and I look forward to learning more healthy habits together.